with Walter Naji.
The major focus of the federal government's agricultural revolution in the last few years has focused on rice production, millet, poultry and a few others. But already, the Standard Organization of Nigeria says so far about 12 rice mills in the country has been certified for production and call on other smaller millers to come on board to ensure safety procedures are followed and production meets international standard.
Certification is not a policing activity that will take people by surprise. We want you to do it right. So when you are ready, you tell us you are ready, we walk in, start the process from the beginning to the end, that is from the raw material to the final product. And together with you, show you that yes, and by the time we do, even you, who is the owner, show, I could have done better. And with that guide, you come up better. And at the end of the day, we certify your product with our shoulder high that the product will meet the requirement of the customers.
Meanwhile, some Nigerians trained in Japan on different agricultural produce and modern methods of farming for improved yield are engaging the Train the Trainer initiative to improve the capacity of beans farmers in the country on the management and handling of post-harvest losses to reduce the cases of low yield among beans farmers in the country.
To strengthen the bilateral agreement between Nigeria and Japan, help the needy society, strengthen Nigeria's economy by applying the knowledge members gain while in training in Japan and doing their work.
So if you find yourself here, whatever knowledge you have, when you go back to your community, please try and disseminate this same information to other farmers that are at home.
It is important for us to look for other ways of preserving or protecting our beans at growth and at storage.
And on the capital market, here is a quick review of the closing figures of trading on the floor of the exchange. With business news, I'm Chimubi Walter Naji.
Thank you very much, Chimubi Walter Naji, for the business package. Next for us on the program is newspaper review.
And our newspaper reviewer, Bayo Toby, is in the studio. Good morning, Bayo.
Thank you, Jumai. Good morning.
Hope you're enjoying
the
new cold.
Good morning, Nigeria. Yes, is the weather. Harmattan is here, and so there's the dust, there is the dryness, and there's also the cold.
And the catarrh and the fever and everything that goes with it. Well, we're enjoying it anyway.
Yes.
Away from the heat. Yes, Lee.
All right, I have the Daily Trust newspaper. Daily Trust newspaper, below the nameplate, we have the following headlines. We will approve Buhari's request for $30 billion loan. And that's attributed to the Senate President. Details on page 3. Baya, we're going to discuss this particular subject matter. The request is not for $30 billion, by the way. Now, Uni Abuja sacks 2 professors and demotes others over sex scandal. Details can be found on page 4. Dollar video clip. Court dismisses case against Ganduje. Details on page 4. Kebbi, Lagos, and Jigawa top list of states with unqualified teachers. That's a special report by the Daily Trust newspaper. And then the infographics there, of course, speak to other aspects of the educational sector that the report focuses on. One of them talks about the proportion of out-of-school children compared to projected population of 6 to 11-year-olds and in-school children. And then FCT and states with the highest and lowest percentage of qualified teachers. That's another illustration there. And total number of furniture in public schools in zones from primary 1 to 6. And distribution of learners in public primary schools in some states. That's the information that, of course, is quite useful in terms of the representation and the details that are provided in the story, with a continuation on page 5. Now, right at the foot of the front page of the paper, subsidy on petrol costs NNPC 1.2 billion naira daily. That's according to the PPROA. Details can be found on page 17. APC paddles Akeredolu, Abosun, Okorocha, Okechukwu, and Usani. Details on page 13. Recapture Kukawa from Boko Haram. Borno governor tells military.
Good one. And from the Punch newspaper this morning, just beside the nameplate, Plateau PDP crisis worsens. Two-party chairman emerge. That story is on page 16. Army redeploys 20 major generals, others in a shakeup. You'll find that story on page 13. And the headlines in the Punch newspaper, December 31st, minimum wage negotiation deadline. Oyo, Rivers, Kwara, Gombe orders failed to raise panels. With riders, Ogun State workers to begin strike on Thursday. We are in the dark in Cross River State, says TUC. You find that story on page 2. And the picture story there, members of Operation Safe Haven in Plateau State during the cleanup of streets to mark the end of the year in Jos. And just at the bottom plate of the Punch newspaper, Oshomole loyalists fume as Obaseki labels ex-governor pathological liar. You find that story on page 16. 40,000 people living with HIV and AIDS in Nasarawa State. That's coming from NACA. You find that story on page 10. And autumn to lift embargo on employment. That story is on page 10 too. Man hires kidnappers, kills brother's 7-year-old boy after 300,000 naira ransom. That story is on page 4 and 5. And APC lifts suspension on Akeredolu, Amosun, Okorocha, and others. That story is on page 16.
Well, there are two stories. There's one that Kingsley drew attention to.
Yes.
That is to say, the loan component that the Federal Executive Council sought from the National Assembly. The correct figure was sought 30.27 billion, covering the period of 2016 to 2018 budget cycle. Now, the 8th National Assembly approved a component. What was not approved is what the Federal Executive Council have represented for appropriation, for approval, and accordingly appropriation. So it is not correct to say that what is sought now is 30 billion. It is, I think, 27.3.
No, actually, we had the Honorable Minister of Finance and Budget here on the program to discuss this particular issue. And part of the information she gave on that occasion is as follows. The loan request was earlier made to the 8th Assembly, as you rightly pointed out, but the loan request was approved only in part. And what is outstanding, which has not been represented, is for 22.7 billion US dollars. And it is not for the federal government alone. Loan facilities for state governments are also included in that, because the federal government serves as guarantor for loans to be taken by state governments. And the loan is not intended to fund the 2020 budget. Those are the clarifications that she intended to make, and that these are low interest loans from multilateral agencies. And ordinarily, Nigeria would not be qualified for such facilities because we are a middle income country. But because the loan facilities come with a very low interest regime, Nigeria, of course, is taking those facilities at this time. Plus the fact that there is a 5-year moratorium on the repayment of the loans, and they are intended, of course, for infrastructure. So she clarified all of those issues. I think we had, was it last week or the week before?
And the Senate President has added that every penny that is approved, the Senate will do due diligence to ensure that they are meant for the purposes for which they were approved. That is for the infrastructure, and there will be due diligence over them. The other error that I think needs to be corrected is that the University of Abuja has dismissed 2 professors and suspended 2 others. The 2 professors include a professor in agriculture. It may be recalled who was caught in a stint operation in Gwarimpa in a sex format episode. Another professor was also sacked. This followed the submission of the report of the 8-man panel that investigated it and sent in a report. The Senate of the University of Abuja approved the dismissal of the 2 professors. There are other 2 professors who were also demoted. They are lecturers. One was demoted from associate professor to senior lecturer, while the other was from a lecturer 1 to an assistant lecturer. They are for various offenses related to inimical, what was described as inimical to good university and academic conduct. Meanwhile, this brings to about four now university professors that have recently been sacked for that. You recall what happened at the Obafemi Awolowo University. Ahmadu Bello University had sacked a professor for sexual harassment. Then OAU has its own, and the 2 lecturers at the University of Lagos are currently on suspension, awaiting investigation and disciplinary action over the BBC stint documentary on sexual harassment. It is not certain whether the 2 professors that are sacked at the University of Abuja will be prosecuted. It may be recalled that it was actually the police who carried out the sting operation at Gwarimpa and arrested the professor. So I think they should be in a position to hold him account. There are indications that the president will be signing the 2020 budget appropriation today. If it does so, today is the president's 77th birthday. Yes. That will be a birthday gift to Nigeria. But however, some papers are raising concerns about the 10.59 trillion appropriation. You will recall that when the president presented the budget on October 8, it was not up to that quantum. But statutory transfers as well as constituency projects increased it with about 2.465 trillion. And this is causing discomfiture. Some papers are reporting that aside from the 100 billion worth of capital projects that was added, another 50 was added. And the chairman, Senate Committee on Information and Publicity, Agwashiki, confirmed that there is 100 billion worth of constituency projects. Senate had 40 billion, while the House of Representatives had 60 billion. But the Senate Committee on Appropriation also said that they discovered additional revenue not captured, so they applied it to departments and ministry. The leadership also reported that the President Muhammadu Buhari had lamented in the past that for 10 years, over 1 trillion has been appropriated for constituency projects, but there is hardly anything to show for it. So this is another area that may cause concern before assent is appended to the 2020 appropriation bill.
Okay, well, let's take the editorial this morning. It's coming from the Blueprint newspaper, and it's at page 12, the recovery of pension from ex-governors.
Well, can I quickly draw attention to this other interesting story? First of all, Rivers State is to take over Suku Oil. This was a ruling from the Federal High Court that upheld the Supreme Court ruling, and therefore the court has directed the Federal Revenue RMFAC, Revenue and Mobilization Fiscal Commission, as well as Office of the Attorney General, to do the needful to ensure that what is due to Rivers State is paid to them. The other report concerned about 11 days to Christmas. There are indications that food prices are dropping, and two papers have reported it. Leadership has reported that its investigation shows a crash in prices of cash crops, especially in the northwest, northeast, as well as the north central. Blueprint is reporting prices of tomato and vegetables have also dropped, and it monitored from markets in Lagos, in the area, two areas in Lagos, Onyibo, as well as which is the other one now, Onyibo, and one other market.
That would be my 12.
Okay, my 12 market.
Yes.
That's good news, actually.
And these are positive repercussions from border closure because we were feeding our neighbors. Foodstuff, vegetables that's going now are stopped going, and therefore prices are beginning to drop. Now to the editorial. The editorial is...
You said 11 days to Christmas. Today is the 17th.
1725, that's about it.
8 days.
8 days.
What about rice?
Rice
Has dropped too?
Rice has dropped, but apparently it has not dropped. How do I mean? If you go for the local rice, I bought local rice 50 kg for 16,000. Okay. But it's available in the supermarket, and unless you ask, they will not sell it to you because they found out that people are coming to buy the local rice, 16,000, rebagging it and selling it at 25,000.
As foreign rice?
Yeah, as foreign rice.
So, but are you sure you bought? Are you sure local rice is 20?
I am sure of what
50
I bought.
kg.
50 kg, I am sure.
That's good news.
No, but I'm saying 25 kg. 25 kg is not less than 10,000.
I am sure of 50 kg. I bought it.
No, 50.
And I was told at the supermarket that unless you ask, you will not see it on display.
No,
because this is what
it's on display. I don't want to mention the names of the Abbey, but we are here in what's called, for those who are familiar with Abuja, we are here in Area 11, which is Garki. Just next to us here is the Central Bank. We have a number of supermarkets close by. After you want us to take a bet, I mean, we're not gamblers. If we were to go to the supermarket now, 50 kg, you won't get it for less than 20,000 in any of those supermarkets close by.
Okay.
You took a bet?
I'm not arguing. I am sure. I bought it myself. I'm sure. Okay. So I'm certain. So now to the editorial.
That's good evidence that you bought
the editorial.
You are using that as a hamper or something? Oh.
Don't worry what I'll use it for, but at least I can prove that. The editorial is happening on the decision of the Lagos High Court by Justice Oluremi or Oguntoyebo that the Office of the Attorney General of the Federation should follow up an order of mandamus to compel states that have passed laws paying extra pensions to persons who are serving in the Federal Executive Council and the National Assembly. And the editorial is saying that this is a very good order. And it is encouraging the Attorney General, particularly that it's been on record. The Attorney General says it is going to follow up through on the directives of the order of the court. But here is the clash. A law that is passed by a state is a law that is subsisting, and most of the states have passed the law. And I remember Kingsley was saying that if you pass a law that is not in consonance with the overall public interest of the nation, that law deserves to be reviewed. I think it is on that premise that law is called to question. By February 3rd, the court will be waiting to hear from the Office of the Attorney General the progress that has been made on that regard, in that regard.
Okay, thank you so much, Bayo. Thanks for your contribution this morning.
Thank you.
Do have a wonderful day. Now we take a break on our discussion for this morning. We'll take a break now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
They swore an oath to serve our fatherland and defend the people. They traded their freedom, comfortable homes, and mortgaged their lives on the battleground for our unity and peaceful living. These are the great, fearless, loyal, and committed Nigerian armed forces who risked their lives courageously to safeguard our borders. But in the line of duty, many never returned. Nigerians, arise, let's celebrate our fallen heroes. Put on the remembrance emblem with pride to support the incapacitated and families of our fallen heroes.
It is indeed befitting to honor the memory of the gallant hearts of young men who paid the supreme sacrifice to keep their country united.
President Muhammadu Buhari enjoins all ministries, parastatals, religious and corporate bodies to donate generously to the Emblem Appeal Launch. Send your donations to these accounts. Account name, Emblem Appeal Launch. Account number 393-200-7526. EcoBank Nigeria PLC.
the dreamer. Meet the stylish. Meet the bold. Meet the inquisitive. Meet the warrior. Meet the master. Meet the realist. The challenge is coming. Unity Challenge. Power, development, and peace. Coming soon.
Thanks for joining us. If you just joined us, you're right on time for our conversation on the review of Nigeria's participation at ASWAN Forum. And to kickstart our discussion, let's take a look at this background report by correspondent Aisha Ubali on the subject matter.
Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has been traveling to various nations in Africa, Europe, and many others to seek partnership in order to attract development and growth. The most recent visit is to Aswan, Egypt, where African leaders met to brainstorm on issues confronting Africa as a continent. The Egypt Meeting for Sustainable Peace and Development in Africa highlighted issues with leaders reaffirming commitment to collaborate more effectively with one another. Nigeria announced efforts targeted at eradicating the menace of terrorism and insurgency not only in the North and West African sub-regions but across the continent. Speakers highlighted the need to intensify efforts towards building a formidable force to fight insecurity. This is with devastating effect of conflict on African nations. President Muhammadu Buhari also used the opportunity to commend the effort of the multinational joint task force, says Nigeria still needs international cooperation to deal with the issues of insurgency, conflict prevention and conflict resolution. Issues were raised in the area of agriculture, infrastructure, investment and technology, with the president explaining that there has been massive investment in transportation infrastructure to facilitate the African Free Trade Agreement signed by the leaders in the region. President Buhari advised African leaders to rely on the continent's expertise, maximizing reliance on donors in the area of aid, while also harping on the issue of corruption and inclusive growth. President Buhari assured the leaders of Nigeria's commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the African Union Goal 2063. What next for Nigeria after the ASWAN Forum? Guest on Good Morning Nigeria will answer to this question and more shortly.
Thank you very much, Aisha Ubali, for that background. With us in the studios, we have two guests. Mr. Femi Adesina, who is the Special Advisor to the President on Media. Mr. Adesina, pleasure to have you with us on the program.
Good morning.
Okay. Also here with us in the studios is Ambassador Usman Sarki. Is Nigeria's former Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York. Your Excellency, pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
On the program. I just was wondering, just before we get on with the details of matters arising from the ASWAN Forum, which took place in Egypt. The first question, therefore, will be going to Ambassador Sarki, against the background of your experience in diplomacy. Are we seeing in recent times the rise of what I will loosely refer to as almost alternative international institutions on account of the several fora that have been organized? The Japanese will organize their forum, the Chinese will organize their forum, India will organize their forum, Sochi in Russia will have their forum, and here we are now, the ASWAN Forum. Of course, El-Sisi, who is the president of Egypt, is the chairman of the AU, and the AU, of course, is an international institution. But what do you make of the plethora, as it were, of fora, focusing on different aspects of Africa, as it were?
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is a very an extremely important question. The Aswan Forum actually is to refocus African minds, African vision, and African attention on African problems, and to bring back the core responsibilities and duties of the African Union itself, to be led by credible and powerful members of the organization towards resolving dichotomies and problems affecting the African continent. And one of the most significant problems in Africa today is the issue of peace and security and the resolution of conflicts. So the plethora of international initiatives that you rightly mentioned are actually appendages to what the African Union itself should have done in terms of leading Africa towards peace and prosperity, towards sustainable development, and towards integration. Unfortunately, because of institutional incapacity and also the hesitant attitude of member states themselves, the AU could not make the great leap forward that is required to take Africa to the next level, as it were. So the Aswan Forum is actually an attention getter in terms of telling Africans and African leaders, sit up, pay attention to Africa, and let us resolve our issues, our problems. And I think, the other international issues, the China-Africa Forum, Japan-Africa, Russia-Africa, they are appendages. They are just sidelines to what we could do internally. And if you look at what President, His Excellency, President Muhammad Buhari said in his statement, that Africa must look inwards, to develop its capacities, to trade more with each other, and also to advance the process of integration. So he listed about 9 points in his statement, which I'm sure Mr. Adeshina will expound, and I will also touch upon. So this is what you raise is very important, and I think the Nigerian government should pay attention to the role that it will play in moving Africa forward towards achieving high-level decisions that were taken by African leaders at the AU summit meetings.
Ambassador Femi, we're still going to have to pause you. I want to return to this question that I posed earlier with regard to the utility of alternative initiatives or fora or alternative international institutions. Last month, the Association of Retired Career Ambassadors had their inaugural lecture. Here in Abuja, it was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the lecture was delivered by Nigeria's former Foreign Minister, Ambassador Ignatius Olesabeke. And I recall that I was present there. One of the side issues that came up had to do with the many initiatives that we talked about, Japan, Africa, China, Africa, Russia, Africa, Indo, Africa, and it appeared from my reading of the voices on that occasion that we seemed, to be demeaning ourselves as a continent by running to various capitals to discuss African problems. So that's why I've raised this issue now, whether we are having a rise of alternative international institutions.
Well, you are quite right, and His Excellency Ambassador Ignatius Olusemeka, my very revered senior and boss, was quite right in raising the flag of alarm over the increasing tendency towards sucking Africa into, pigeonholes, created by other countries, located elsewhere outside the continent. But as you know, diplomacy is the art of the possible. People in capitals, in foreign ministries, in chancelleries, they sit down to strategize and think. How do we engage with Africa? How do we engage with Nigeria? And they develop scenarios and strategies in their think tanks, and they translate this into actions. So actually, it is not their fault for seeking to engage us on a larger and broader scale. You may say it is our incapacity, our deficiency, in terms of not being coherent and integrated enough to present a united front to the rest of the world. If we could do so, I don't think countries like Russia, China, Indonesia, Iran, India will want to engage with Africa they as an individual country and we as 53 countries or so. So I think we need to rethink our own approach to global integration, global diplomacy, and also create niches for ourselves, and this is why I'm saying Nigeria should lead the process. It is not a bad thing we are not an island unto ourselves. We have to engage with the world, but let us develop the capacity to engage with the world on our own terms. And I think that is what foreign ministries are there for. That is where think tanks like the National Institute for Policy and Strategic Study at Kuro are there for, to advise government on what to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ambassador Osman Saki, we'll get back to you on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Femi Adesina, there's somebody described it as a scramble for Africa again, from colonialism to economic partners, and Nigeria tops the list. What's your take on that?
Well, all over the world there are scrambles. It's either for Africa or some other part of the world. But like the ambassador said, it must be on our own terms. Because there's this scramble, we then should not be sitting duck and take whatever is thrown at us. No, it must be on our terms. Why has the scramble become compelling? Because Africa has large deficits in different areas. Infrastructure, economy, peace, security, development. And so when you see people offering what you lack, for the sake of your people, you will take it. But mind you, look at the terms and don't just walk with your eyes open into booby traps. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's something that should be embraced, but carefully.
Well, still on that, Mr. Adesina, again, part of the question that I posed to Ambassador Osman Saki, you've been on the president's delegation to some of this fora, along, of course, with your colleague, Malam Garba Shehu. What are the optics that you find at this fora? I mean, it's not the United Nations, for instance, neither is it the African Union, but that's where you have had Africa congregate, under the auspices of some other country, as it were. What is it you find? I mean, is it a tendency to say, okay, we are one country, we're going to relate to you, which, some ambassadors now, Nigerian diplomats, find somewhat undiplomatically demeaning?
Well, what I rather find is a win-win situation. When most of this country come with packages for Africa, it is not like a dole. It is not like a Lagis. It is not Christmas once again. No, it is a win-win situation. They bring this to the table, then they say this is what we also have to gain from it. So it's a win-win situation. And each, after those meetings, when the presidents come, they have discussed, the bureaucracy follows. It is then the duty of the bureaucracy to ensure that the best deal is cut for each country. So I don't think anything is being forced down the throats of the countries. It is what you want that you accept.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Femi Adesina. Now, we are also being joined now by another regular guest on Good Morning Nigeria, Ambassador Dauda Danladi, Nigeria's former envoy to Pakistan. Ambassador, pleasure to have you with us on Good Morning Nigeria again.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Okay. Well, let's welcome, but we're not going to ask you a question here. We want to just go straight back to Femi Adesina, who was with the president at the Aswan Forum. What, in your opinion, was the success line arising from that forum?
Thank you. This was a forum for African leaders to discuss African problems and profile solutions, which I think was very good because the continent knows what its problems are. The theme of that forum was the Africa we want. And it's very, very instructive, the Africa we want. The Africa we want will not be engendered by foreigners. It is Africans themselves who will bring to bear the kind of continent they want. And there was a panel discussion in which all the presidents that were there spoke about the issues on the continent from their different perspectives, with emphasis on their countries, and each went ahead to proffer solutions. For instance, our president spoke about the need to silence the guns on the continent. He has said unless the conflicts are resolved amicably, Africa cannot develop. Because all the resources you should use for development go into warfare. Conflicts in Africa can be very, very expensive in terms of economy, in terms of the destruction of the social and economic fabric and all that. So each president came with his own perspective of what the problems are and what is the way forward.
What was your attendance like?
Yes, you had the host president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. You had the Nigerian president, president of Chad, of Niger, of Comoros. South Africa was to be there, but had to leave because there was that massive power failure in his country, so he had to go back home. Those were the people. I think it was a selection from different regions in Africa. It was not meant to be a mass attendance thing because el-Sisi is the chairman of the AU. So I think they were being careful not to make it another AU meeting. Okay, so they picked from the different sub-regions in Africa.
Those with peculiar challenges?
Well, you will find out that most of the challenges peculiar to those countries are African challenges. So by the time you pick from each sub-region, you have an aggregate of what the African challenge is. Okay.
So we'll now bring in former ambassador to Pakistan, Daud Naladi, and what benefits do you think Nigeria got in terms of economy, international relations, and diplomatic talks from the Aswan Forum?
Well, this is a good question, but I think I have to start by really commending the president for leading Nigeria to various international investment forum and platforms so that Nigeria can tap in to accelerate the pace of our development and industrialization. And I think it is good to take just a quick cursory look at the platforms. In China, it was 60 billion naira that was placed on the table for African countries to access for infrastructural and at the same time industrialization and capacity building. In Tokyo, Japan, I think it was the sum of $40 billion that was put on the table there. That again is to partner with African countries in the area of innovation and technology. In Sochi, Russia, Russia gave a debt relief of about $20 billion, and they have opened up their doors for cooperation in the areas of oil and gas, mining, in the areas of agriculture and education, and of course in the areas of security, military development. As you know, there's the need for African countries really to develop their local industries if they can put strategic offsets in their procurement of military equipment so that the defense industries in African countries could grow. So, and in Saudi Arabia, it's a sovereign wealth of about $400 billion that was placed on the table there. And I think looking at the deep bilateral relationship between Nigeria and Saudi Arabia, there's a tendency that they will invest in the oil and gas sector of Nigeria. We're looking forward, hopefully, to the commencement of the rehabilitation of the Port Harcourt refinery first quarter of 2020, and perhaps the Kaduna refinery will be on board by the year 2020. That will eliminate the huge subsidy that Nigeria is paying for the importation of fuel, and will give us the required funds to really get 100 million Nigerians out of poverty. Now, this is just a small, quick, cursory look at the various investment platforms. But when you look at what is happening in the African continent, you cannot really grow, you cannot develop in the absence of peace and security. And in the African continent, it is estimated that we lose about $18 billion annually to conflicts and violence in Africa. And in Africa, again, through the menace of corruption has also stultified development. The Transparency International states that about $50 billion is lost annually in Africa. Now imagine what these funds could have done to the African continent. When you look at in terms of resources, Africa houses 30% of the world known proven resources. Yet Africa is poor. It's not Africa that is poor. It's we Africans that are poor. The continent is rich. All that is required is to mobilize the robust investments around the world so that Africa could develop. It is really mind-boggling that the FOA gave a figure of about over 200 million Africans are living in poverty. 100 million are living in extreme abject poverty. Now that is unacceptable, looking at the huge, vast resources that Africa has. On climate change, again, Africa is at the receiving end. Billions of dollars are being lost annually to floods from Nigeria to Tanzania to Zimbabwe. The Lake Chad has receded. It has affected the lives, according to Mr. President, affected the lives of about 40 million people living along the Lake Chad Basin. So I think when you look at, again, the issue of conflict, globally, about 65.5 million people are displaced, mostly in the sub-Saharan African countries, and of course the Middle East. So I think this, as one meeting, the theme is achieving peace and sustainable development. I think it is timely and it is apt. And I think the President has really has drawn the attention of African leaders to some of the teething issues that has stultified development in Africa, from corruption to violence to lack of robust investment that can really harness the potential that Africa has so that we can move forward. Now, I think, again, other areas that really requires serious attention is that at least we have signed the African Continental Trade. That trade agreement is expected to generate about 6.7 trillion by the year 2030. If fully implemented, the welfare gains that will accrue to Africa within that period is about almost 16 billion US dollars. And I think the President has set the pace, has set the tone that we have to bring down barriers to allow free movement of persons, goods and services across the African continent so that we can fast track the development of the African Union.
Okay, Ambassador Donladi, thanks a lot. Let's bring in again Ambassador Usman Sarki. In terms of the choice of the theme, the Africa we want, silencing the guns, how Africa can also engineer the prevention process in trying to silence the guns. How, in your opinion, relevant was this broad theme of the Africa we want? And then did the outcomes justify the choice of the theme?
Yeah, thank you. As I said at the beginning of my intervention, that the Aswan Summit or Forum refocused African attention on Africa's problems. And one of the problems, the most important problem in Africa today, is conflict. So the silencing the gun by 2020, of course it is very self-evident that it's not possible to achieve that by 2020. However, steps are being taken to strengthen the capacity of African governments and states to develop resilience in terms of conflicts, and also to perfect our mechanisms for conflict resolution. The key issue now is how do we prevent conflicts from happening in the first place? And Mr. President's statement in terms of drawing attention to the architecture, peace and security architecture in Africa was very critical. President El-Sisi, in February, when he took over the presidency of the chairmanship of the African Union, in his speech in Addis Ababa, he mentioned that he was going to bring about the Aswan Summit in December. Since February, he made that statement. And in it, he said, focusing our attention on the African peace and security architecture is very critical, is very crucial, in order to develop our early warning systems, in order to develop our horizon scanning capabilities, and also in order to develop our mechanisms for negotiating the end to conflicts in Africa. And I think his speech has been translated into action in the Aswan process. Now, what have we gained out of it? It is too soon, too early, after 1 week of a conference to say that you have attained this and that. But the important thing is that our consciousness has been now reawakened in terms of the need for us to act collectively to develop mechanisms to protect our continent against conflicts. The important issue also that we have to realize is that you cannot wish conflicts away. While the meeting was going on, terrorist attacks in western Niger left 70 gallant soldiers of that country dead. And the president of Niger had to hastily abandon the meeting to come back to meet this national emergency. And as we were speaking right now, the situation in South Sudan, in Somalia, and many other parts of Africa do not present a happy picture. Libya is in turmoil. So you find that there is a need for African leaders to concentrate on how to resolve conflicts and prevent them from happening in future. We need strategies, we need policies. African development rests on 3 key pillars. One, the AU initiative for 2063, that is the AU agenda. And embedded within that agenda is the PIDA or PIDA, the Program of Infrastructure Development for Africa, and then the Common African Agriculture Plan. We cannot achieve those far-reaching, almost holistic, encompassing development plans when we don't have peace in the continent. Mr. President, the first solution he offered was to perfect the mechanisms for conflict prevention, resolution, amelioration, and reconstruction. And by the way, Egypt is planning to establish what they call the Post-Conflict and Reconstruction and Development Commission, a sort of standing committee in Aswan. They call it the PRCD, Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Development Commission. It is very important that we develop our own inbuilt internal capacities to withstand conflicts, to develop resilience, and also to prevent conflicts. The other issue, which is not spoken very much in relation to the Aswan summit, was the issue of forced migration of people, by conflict. A lot of Africans are leaving their countries because of forced situations, because of conflict. Mr. President has said that we are losing our youth, in our communities. We are losing our innocence, actually, to conflicts. And Mr. Adesina has said conflicts is costing Africa hugely in terms of life, property, and economy. If we don't address conflict, Africans will flee from their countries. We cannot even settle our minds to attend to issues associated with climate change. We cannot develop our economies. We cannot create conducive and harmonious societies, which actually the UN SDGs aim to do, to create peaceful and prosperous communities and societies. Without peace, you cannot do that. So I think the outcome is too early to say we have achieved this. But the important thing is the sensitization and consciousness development, which has arisen out of the meeting.
Okay, and based on that, breaking the barriers across Africa in trade and economy, the president made an announcement in Egypt on a new visa policy, visa on arrival, at the point of arrival. But, experts are saying the policy still remains unclear. People are not really sure what it means because it was a statement that was not really explained. Mr. Adesina.
Yes, I think we need to get what the statement was in its proper perspective. Is visa on arrival for people holding African passports. That's very significant. People holding African passports. Because the intention is integration of the continent. The way some people are going on is that the rest of the world is being opened. Nigeria is open to the rest of the world and people can flock in in an unbridled manner. Not so. Visa on arrival will have rules, will have policies, will have guidelines and instructions that you must follow. The next thing is for maybe the Immigration Service to now issue guidelines. And I saw a statement from the immigration just 3 or 4 days ago. So it's something that is in progress. It will start in January 2020. And between now and that time, which is just about 2 weeks ago, the guidelines can be made very clear. The intention is integrate Africa. Holders of African passport. For instance, I've seen the argument that, oh, you are opening the doors for herdsmen from other countries to flock into Nigeria again. I don't think those category of people are the ones that will carry passports normally. And you have the porous borders all over the place, which those ones can use to come in and go out. But this is a structured movement. You come through the regular points of entry with your passport, and then you receive visa at entry point.
What if you don't meet the requirements? Will you be returned?
Naturally. Naturally. It goes without saying that a lot of people will be sent back to where they were coming from if they do not meet the requirements.
I just wondered, since the matter is on the table, I mean, let's get back to the two diplomats, the Kenya ambassador, Usman Sharki. There are diplomatic issues, some persons will say, with this presidential proclamation on visa on arrival as a new immigration policy. Some persons have raised the issue of reciprocity, that it isn't just a freebie. You don't open up your borders. It has to be on the basis that some other country, extends such courtesies to your own nationals.
Well, it is actually a realization of an existing, situation that Mr. President pronounced. Within the ECOWAS region, we move freely. With your passport, you can just enter any member country and they stamp your passport and you gain entrance into that country. What we are now doing is just to extend the frontiers, of accessibility of Nigeria for other African countries. And it is something about time that was done. During the chairmanship of the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, the issue of African passport, actually, an African common passport, was raised as part of the AU strategy towards moving Africa to greater and accelerated integration. You cannot achieve a continental African free trade and accelerated economic integration when people are kept apart by artificial means like visas and borders. So we have to be courageous enough at one point to start breaking down these artificial borders and barriers. These were, as you know, imposed by the exigencies of our history. It was not things that we developed. We inherited them from the colonial times, borders and visas and passports. Breaking these barriers will create the psychological freedom for people to feel that, yes, I can come to Nigeria, do business, and go back to my country. Or I can come to Nigeria, meet Nigerians, felicitate, do things, and then go back, or to stay to do business. It's not an unconditional issue. For instance, in the ECOWAS, we had 3 tiers of the free movement. When you come into the country, first was to actually, after 90 days, you go out and you come back. Then you can now come after, I think, they extended the period where you can stay for up to 6 months, and then now you can stay to do business. So other Africans coming will not be just a free-for-all issue. You have to be vetted, for instance, when you come in, that you don't have terrorist credentials or some criminal background. So we need to now build up the capacity of our immigration service to be able to cope with this. But as a civil servant, or as a former civil servant, I have to say that when a president says something, when Mr. President speaks, it is policy. Even if he speaks at a cocktail party or dinner party gathering, he says, by January we will do this. Civil servants should scramble towards actually putting into effect what he said at that dinner table, at that cocktail. So President's statements are not in vain. They are very important. They are given a lot of credence, by people in the system, by civil servants. So we have to now take it seriously that by January, any African passport holder will come into the country at any entry point to obtain a visa.
Yeah, Ambassador Sankey, thanks. Ambassador Donlade, but the other leg, which is the views that I'm sure you have seen expressed in the media, has to do with reciprocity. Yes, Nigeria is opening up her borders to bona fide travelers to say, look, come in, and then you have your visa on arrival. It is not a right of residency, but we do know that Nigerians experience a great deal of challenges trying to get into some African countries, other than those who are, for instance, in the ECOWAS region. So what's your response to this, that there appears to be no reciprocity from other regions?
I think again, it is still too early to say this, because this meeting just took place a few days ago, and of course, as I have said earlier, and what the ambassador has said is that as we begin to really implement the African Continental Trade Agreement, I strongly believe that our president has set the pace, and other African countries will follow to reciprocate. But let me just say this, that in terms of the gains of Aswan, I think one takeaway really is that is the sideline meeting between the president, our president, and of course the Egyptian president, where they have agreed to synergize to combat the menace of terrorism. As you know, in the West African region, we have the multinational task force, which I believe it's been funded 100% by the federal government. And if you look at the resurgence or emergence of really brand new acts of terrorism in Mali, Burkina Faso, and in Niger, vis-a-vis the tendency of the Arab Maghreb countries, I'm talking about Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and in fact Libya, there is a need for them to emulate what has been put in place in the West African region, to also set up a task force that would checkmate the proliferation of elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS that could have safe havens to operate within the Arab Maghreb countries. So I think the takeaway there is that since LCC has promised and is a strong Arab African country, I strongly believe that they will be able to put in place a multinational task force that would checkmate activities within the Arab Maghreb, so that we can really eliminate the issue of terrorism in the African continent. Again, we have to also give our president the credit for really drawing the attention of the African leaders at the forum on the need for integration. The Pan-African dream and vision cannot be achieved in the absence of an integration and unity. And I think Mr. President has done a good job. Reciprocity really would be a catalyst for the smooth diplomatic interaction within the African continent, and will also promote the free movement of goods and services across the continent.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ambassador Ladi. The discussion will continue after this break. If you're just joining us, this is Good Morning Nigeria, and we'll be talking about Nigeria's participation at the Aswan Forum. Don't go away.
My name is Balaunti. I'm the Managing Director of Petroleum Product Marketing Company, a subsidiary of NNPC. There are significant price discrepancy between Nigeria and its neighbors across Africa. There's a discrepancy of between 150 to 250 naira. That creates an incentive for arbitrage, whereby smuggling triumphed by taking petroleum product across the neighbors so that they can be sold at higher price. While the smugglers are making the money, Nigeria is paying for it. And that payment is distorting everything that we do in terms of planning, in terms of our ability to fund, and thereby taking money that is meant for development. The introduction of this Operation White will have a reduction of close to 6 million liters on a daily basis, which if you take an average of 150, translate to a saving of over 1 billion naira every day. That is the benefit of Operation White, and we have started seeing the great benefit.
Chief, good morning, sir. You are here already?
No, now my spirit day, my body day for house. What kind of question is that? Were you not the one that fixed this meeting for 8 a.m.? You are now coming by 10 a.m. and start asking me jab questions.
But Chief, now, I'm sorry. Don't you also go late for meetings sometimes? You know now, African time.
No more African time. And no more pancaking of face during office hours. At the end of the day, we will lose valuable time. We will not make progress. If we want to move this nation forward, we must treat business as business and respect time. Change begins with me.
Thank you, sir. I'm sorry. Can we go for the meeting now, Chief?
Better.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency in conjunction with the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
Welcome back to Good Morning Nigeria, and we've been discussing Nigeria's participation at the ASUAN Forum. You know, one takeaway from the forum that I noticed was the way President Muhammadu Buhari talked with passion about women and children contributing to the peace and security of the continent. What was the in-depth discussion they had with President El-Sisi on that?
Yes, the summit was structured in terms of panels. There were about 9 different panels. And one panel discussed the role that women can play in conflict prevention and resolution. Okay. And it was like a unanimous opinion that when there are conflicts, those who suffer most are women, children, and the elderly. Therefore, they also should be allowed to have to play roles in resolution and prevention of conflicts. So it was a panel in itself, and the different African leaders spoke about it. And at the end of that session, it was agreed that yes, women will have a role, a key role to play in the prevention and resolution of conflicts in Africa. Our president also had a say, because he had spoken about inclusive governance on the continent earlier. So it was an opportunity to build on it, roles women can play. And what came to the fore was that it's not that women must be ministers only. You know that the cry in Nigeria is, oh, you have just 5 or 7 women in your cabinet. There are many other roles that women can play. And
but you know, Mr. Additional, this has always been an issue. Yes. I do hope that it's not become a matter of sloganeering. They still look vulnerable groups and how women can be mainstreamed into conflict prevention and conflict resolution or peace building. I mean, there's virtually no forum you go to where you don't have that perspective. But the question, I mean, you're a journalist as well, is the how. We talk about economic empowerment, we talk about education. But how well are African countries faring on this account? Just aside from political participation, education, access to economic empowerment and new opportunities.
Yes, access to education was what our president particularly dwelled upon. Yes, there must be massive opportunities to educate everybody, including women. For instance, he spoke about keeping African capacities in Africa. And he said one of the ways you can keep those capacities on the continent was to educate everybody. He spoke about young people daring the Sahara Desert, daring the Mediterranean to emigrate to other parts of the world. But he said if there were opportunities, if you build infrastructure, if you build education, if you expand opportunities for them to flourish within the continent, those kind of irregular migration will not happen again. So education was one of the ways our president harped upon in which African capacities could be kept on the continent, and for women particularly.
Well, Ambassador Usman Sarki, again, back to one of the sub-themes of of the Aswan Forum, owning the prevention agenda in terms of trying to silence the guns. But you know, we can discuss these ideas. As you said, the forum has enabled, you know, further consolidation of stakeholders on the African continent. Yes. But what is it, in your opinion, that we need to focus on in terms of actually owning the prevention agenda while we are seeking to silence the guns that have been the bane of our development as a continent?
Yes. Well, thank you. This is a very important question. And I think I will link it to institutional capacity building. A lot of African countries don't have the capacity institutionally to actually further the cause of prevention of conflict. Conflicts flare up at community levels, and you don't have enough police, you don't have enough soldiers, you don't have courts of law, you know, to prosecute miscreants, and you find the conflagration you know, spreading, you know, from one community to the other. And then before you know it, a structured type of conflict emerges, and the merchants of death will start supplying weapons. And instability now ensues, and Africa becomes another hotbed of crisis. So the building of capacities internally in every country is very essential. The African Union Peace and Security Architecture, the APSA, must now be localized. It has to be spread and decentralized to regional levels and country levels, whereby we can now develop our architecture for prevention. If we don't do this, we will always be at the mercy of external intervention, like we see today in Mali, where the French and other forces are there for the last 6 years or so, but it hasn't helped matters. In fact, some people are saying the situation is being compounded by the presence of foreign troops and foreign peacekeepers. In the DRC, for the last 30 years or so, the UN peacekeeping troops are there. It hasn't stopped conflict. Only yesterday, I think I saw in Eastern Congo attacks, you know, on communities. So we need strategies, we need policies. And I dare say that institutions like NIPS in Kuru, the NIIA in Lagos, and other think tanks must be brought together to sit down to formulate concrete, implementable programs for government to implement in terms of developing our capacity for conflict prevention. We have the Center for Conflict Prevention and others, so these institutions must be empowered resource-wise and to be actually consulted by government. They are there, but sometimes government does not consult them. So they need to be consulted in terms of what they can bring to the table by way of advice. And our foreign policy must be dynamic in terms of engaging with neighboring countries and other countries far away to create synergy. For instance, Mr. President spoke about the Lake Chad Basin task force, you know, the multinational joint task force. While we are doing our work in the enclave of Lake Chad, you have the G5 of the Sahel countries also operating in their silo. Why can't we combine our efforts, since what affects the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso also will have reverberations on Nigeria? So why can't we develop these strategies, these synergies to link all these initiatives in order to create a climate whereby we can effectively anticipate terrorist actions and anticipate factors that create instability and address them early.
Okay, Ambassador Osman, thank you so much. Ambassador Ladi, you know, they said participation of the private sector in African economies, which was one of the ideas behind the conference. And the African Development Bank has come in to say that apart from fighting terrorism, electricity is also an issue in Africa. Because when you want to bring in partners to work with you in your country, you need to give them power for them to function. So how do we get access? With so much money out there by the African Development Bank, do you foresee a future where Africa will be powered for economic growth?
Yeah, I think you are right, because it is estimated that about over 300 million Africans live without electricity.
600.
Over 620, yes. So without electricity. And we have the resources. Nigeria, for example, has about 184 trillion cubic feet of gas, and all that is required is really to harness these resources so that it can really provide the energy requirement of the African continent if we can develop our gas sector. It is true that private sector has a key role to play, and I think during the Aswan business moguls, business giant construction companies, and the business community participated, and I think the opportunities are there if we can really ensure that there is exchange of ideas, there is constant business forum between the two countries, and of course, if African countries will really key into the African continental trade to see various areas that they can partner. The various investment platforms that Mr. President has led Nigeria to has provided a robust opportunity to develop the private sector. If you're looking at from China to Saudi Arabia to TICAD in Japan, the opportunities are there. But what is required is for us to develop the strategies that will open up the doors for the private sector to engage actively so that they can really drive the development process in the African continent.
Ambassador Danladi, I'd like to pause you here and then just remind us of what Ambassador Usman Sarki said, with regard to having the African conception, to dealing with our challenges. Look, one of the issues we're just talking about now has to do with power. And Ambassador Sarki also talked about utilizing our think tanks to drive this. Some persons have argued that power, that's electricity, it's not a big deal anymore in the world. But it's a big deal for us in Africa. It's not anywhere in the world. It's not a big deal anymore. Power is taken for granted. I mean, when you fly, when you are landing in the cities are elsewhere in the world, the cities they are ablaze, with light, So it's not. Is it a matter of conception that perhaps we haven't been able to get the right mix of how to attract that investment? I don't want to reference this, but let me just mention it in passing with the greatest respect to all us who are Africans. There's a mindset that, that's the dark continent, so let it remain in darkness. How do we break that so that you get this investment, because it's an opportunity for the big bucks, to bring in and then also have their profit. Look, when you look at Iraq, Iraq was virtually ground to the dust following Gulf War II. But the same way they've been rebuilding their power infrastructure, everything happening, virtually within a short space of time. And here is this typical lamentation, Africa, 600 million people have no access to electricity. What do we need to do to overcome, if you like, either that philosophical or psychological barrier that foreign investors have with regard to coming into our power sector?
With $12 billion on the table.
I think, again, it's the issue of institutional capacity. And again, it is the issue of getting our priorities right by strategizing and to see that we tap into the various investment platforms that have been provided. For example, Russia is offering a nuclear energy to African countries. And I see no reason why we will not strategize to see how we can tap in so that we will have the required power supply. Power is a critical infrastructure, and it is really disheartening that, mind-boggling that in the 21st century, we are still lacking behind in African countries in terms of power supply. But in Nigeria, I think Mr. President has set the pace. Recently, he signed a deal with Siemens to provide 25,000 megawatts of electricity within the next 5 years. And I think going forward with the resuscitation, supposed resuscitation of our refineries and the drive to explore opportunities in our oil and gas sector, I think we will begin to address this issue of electricity, not only in Nigeria, but in West African countries. Right now, I think we are even assisting some of the African countries with power.
And they haven't paid their bills. And they haven't paid their bills. I mean, that issue. Ambassador Usman Saki, what's your take on this? Is there something that we need to overcome, to be able to open up and then get the right kind of investment? Yeah, we hear all of these matters that are being, all the monies that are being put on the table, but 5 years down the line, we probably will still be talking about the same situation when you're looking at the ratio of the population that has access to electricity. Whereas, as we said, look, it's not a big deal anymore in most parts of the world. But why does it remain a big deal for us on the African continent?
Well, I think, to answer you, I shall be the typical Nigerian to ask you a question. Actually answering you this thing. How did Iran get it? How did Iraq get it? How did Egypt get it? How did Syria, despite the devastating war going on, they still have electricity? How did they get it? How Libya get it? Palestine, if they show you Gaza at night, despite the destruction, devastation, you will be amazed and shocked. How did they get it? And why is Nigeria not getting it right? I think the capacity of the state to mobilize resource, to instill discipline, and to actually abide by the laws and regulations, this is what is lacking in Nigeria, I must say, very frankly. The discipline required to allocate resources, to follow up on the utilization of the resources, and to ensure that the end result is attained that is what the critical factor that is missing in our country. Successive administrations will come, vote huge amounts of money, but the public has no way of actually monitoring and knowing how these funds are being used. You ask the average Nigerian, how many institutions do we have related to power? We cannot count them. Each one has its own vote, each one has its own responsibilities, but collectively, the aggregate result, the impact of each one is not being felt. So the discipline and the capacity of the state to mobilize and deliver seems to be weakened successively because of inattention. Like Ambassador Danladi said, President Muhammadu Buhari has shown the commitment to get it right. But is he being supported by the institutions? This is the critical question. Is our civil service strong enough to push towards actually energizing the country? Is the private sector, we are talking about private sector in Nigeria as if it's something that is there, tangible and strong. This private sector in Nigeria, to my mind, is ephemeral. It is weak. It doesn't have an enlightened self-interest. It is a dependent, predatory almost, private sector. Look at the banks, what have the banks contributed towards the development of this country? Agriculture, power, infrastructure. They don't have the capacity. And if foreign investors come into the country, they look at the spreadsheet and the profile of the banks, there is nothing to write home about. Today, I don't know if there is any bank in Nigeria where you can raise $100 million, confidently in terms of counterpart funding from the private sector. You have isolated big giants that are doing their best to develop the economy, like Dangote, groups and others. But the rest, what can you say about them? So the government itself must instill the discipline in terms of developing the structure and policy. And our laws must be strengthened. Where you fail to perform, you are liable to certain penalties. In Israel, when you are given a road to construct, and when you default to deliver on the due date, actually you are penalized. But if you perform before the due date, you are actually given some incentives by way of bonuses. Why can't we do this? We were talking about the Kano-Abuja road yesterday. It was on the Daily Trust. It's behind schedule. And actually, the existing road is collapsing, they said. And the same thing with power stations, wherever you go in the country. So Mr. President should now assemble a national, in fact a global think tank, led by not the ministries, but by the Africa Development Bank, for instance, to bring capacity and professionalism to examine what is critically wrong with the power sector, and then adopt a strategy towards implementation and allow an independent body. Because Nigerians today are faulting the privatization exercise itself as really a problem in itself, and it did not solve anything. So we have to be transparent, we have to be honest to own up that we need a lot to do. Ambassador Danladi referred to the gas situation. You are tapping gas from the Niger Delta to develop a power station in the western part of the country or northern part, and somebody will wake up one day to say they are stealing our resources and vandalize it. This is Nigeria. So the capacity of the state needs to be strengthened, almost to be made sacrosanct, whereby once you take a misstep in terms of vandalizing public property, the severest penalty will be meted out to you as an individual or community. This is the best way for us to do. We cannot allow Nigeria to go to the docks based on sentiments, based on hatred and incapacitation inflicted by ourselves on ourselves.
And this is why some would say that some of the issues continue to linger. I mean, not just in Nigeria, but elsewhere on the African continent. I mean, you see the political will expressed by the president, and as you have rightly pointed out, Ambassador, where we have institutional weakness. That's where these things are manifest. To be honest, I mean, people keep asking the question: just why is it such a major challenge to generate power? Generate, distribute, let people have electricity, so that alibi of saying, your power situation is a challenge, it becomes something else.
History, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
But let me mention that there was actually a panel session on power in Africa, generating power during the summit. Yes, and part of the discussion was mobilizing resources to generate power, to sustain power, and to rebuild. It wasn't one of the...
Femi, look, let's talk like a journalist now. Ambassador Sarki has drawn attention to the fact that, look, we have almost a dependent private sector. You don't have a private sector that can stand on its own. Mostly these are mom and pop businesses that wouldn't be like the widely dispersed ownership you have in big environments. And the financial services sector is not leveraging development in the economy. So how do we overcome all of this? Which bank can you go to today and say, okay, here is a business proposal, counterpart funding $200 million. Put it down. That bank probably will go under. So why are we, and then the banks, we have discussed it on Good Morning Nigeria, they are, as we are here, and I'm sure you will have received text messages, they are charging you for monthly card maintenance fee, charging you for withdrawal and so on. This little irritating transaction. In the meantime, the bigger funds that we are supposed to mobilize, we are unable to mobilize those funds. How do we grow the CBN? We have seen CBN has become almost a retail banker. Getting into anchor borrowers, and it's of course galvanizing activities in those sectors. But what do we do with the other sectors? These are issues that I believe that should be of concern in the management of the political economy.
Yes, and the African Development Bank was there.
Yes,
our own Dr. Kim Additional was there, and I'm sure all those were factored in.
Okay, Nigerians are talking. We have a number of tweets that came in. We'll start with Omo Bolahan Babs. He said, the insecurity that bedevils the African continent from the east, west, north, and central should be jointly fought. There is no meaningful development in an atmosphere that is not secured. If we can fight tooth and nail corruption and insecurity, then development is assured. African heads must come together to fight against the monster called corruption. It is the bane of our development. Look at the continent. What you see in most countries is poverty as a corollary of corruption orchestrated by bad and malfeasance leadership.
Montana Farouk. President Buhari's visit to Aswan is a deliberate involvement of Nigeria to act as one of the drivers of the African continent. It's high time for Nigeria, in particular and Africa in general, to concentrate and develop African potentials against foreign ideas.
Sani Michael Mokoji tweets, Other African countries do not need visa to enter Nigeria, but we are often subjected to all manners of harassment each time we visit other African countries. This is unfair and it must not continue.
Now, Comrade Ngala, Mr. President's presence in Egypt will bring some development to the country, more especially on tackling insecurity.
And Abdul tweets, anything that has to do with the security of our regions is a welcome development. I do hope all the bilateral agreements regarding security signed at the Aswan conference would be implemented to the fullest. Enough of carnage in our regions.
Utulo Sunday, we know our problems, which of course include unemployment and the cause of insecurity across the African continent. African leaders should tackle unemployment and peace will reign on the continent again.
And that's about the tweets.
Yeah, those are the tweets that we have. I just was wondering, back again to Ambassador Danladi, with Nigeria's ambassador to Pakistan, and of course with a great deal of experience involving Afghanistan. And we know the conflict in those areas and the rise of terror groups, whether it was Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so on and so forth, and the franchise that they tend to also distribute to elsewhere in the world. In particular, we have seen that on the African continent. ISIS, we have seen Al-Shabaab in East Africa, we have seen ISWAP, in the West African sub-region, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Well, I just was wondering, you see, because if back again to the Aswan Forum, where they said owning the prevention agenda, is it all two wars necessarily don't look alike? Two forms of conflict don't necessarily look alike. Is it the case that, say, on the African continent, we get drawn into a global agenda as set by the global powers and say, look, this is the matter that we must fight now. It's a terror agenda, we must fight it. And the kind of terror that the rest of the world faces wasn't the kind of terror that we were facing on the African continent, even though the franchise eventually came and then we are seeing the type now. Can we on the African continent conceptualize our own potential conflicts so that they don't get fed by the spillover, if you like, from elsewhere in the world as being pursued or as being tackled by the major powers? I don't know whether my question is clear. Yeah. We have our typical, situations. Why is it that the world would like, the major powers would like us to fight their own wars, whereas our own kinds of wars are not being focused on?
Well, I think the question you have put across, there is no clear-cut answer to this question because it is a dynamic situation and terrorism has a global face. It has developed into trans-border violence or whatever. But the fact is that we have to learn from what has happened in other countries. In Pakistan, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, they had about almost 39 terrorist organizations. And Al-Qaeda was just number 5. You have the Jandullah, you have the Red Brigade, you have the TTP, the Taliban of Pakistan, Taliban of Afghanistan. But they have been able to put in place an international collaborative effort towards addressing terrorism in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And they've been able to reduce the organizations from 39 to about 5 organizations now, 5 notorious organizations. And as we have said, the franchise, of course, has reached us here in Africa, but I think the first step that should be taken really, if we borrow from what the President has said, is one, let's resolve the crisis in Libya. If we can resolve the crisis in Libya, it will stem the tide of arms proliferation. It will block passages for Al-Qaeda elements and ISIS elements to operate and to ship goods right down through Mali up to perhaps Chad and Nigeria. If we also address the issue of Somalia, there's a need to resolve the crisis in Somalia. There's a need to stem the resurgence of terrorism in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso. Now, the Arab Maghreb countries, really, to some extent, I think one can say without any iota of doubt that it has, to a large extent, provided sanctuary for elements of Al-Qaeda and ISIS to operate within those axes. And what the president has said, he drew a reference to what has been put in the West African region, the multinational task force. There is a need for us to have a joint task force that will address the issue of terrorism, especially in the Arab Maghreb countries. And to a large extent, I think that would create the impact that is required towards really eradicating the menace of terrorism. But terrorism has a global face, and we have to collaborate globally. We must cooperate in order to stem the tide of terrorism. It is not an isolated issue, but it's an international issue, and it cut across boundaries. It has no respect for boundaries, actually, and therefore I would not agree with you totally that it is we should not be dragged into fighting other people's war. No, it is we are also affected indirectly or indirectly. We live in a global village. What happens in one part of the globe will resonate in the other part of the globe. So I do not totally agree with you in that respect. But,
okay, thank you. If I still building on that, Mr. Femi Adesina, they say no country can survive on its own, and Nigeria cannot operate in isolation. We're in focus without border closure. A lot of countries are saying, why is it taking so long? Was it an issue at Aswan?
No,
it wasn't.
No, it didn't. It didn't come up. Okay. Yeah, like I said, there were about 9 panel discussions, but none focused on that. Okay. It was not.
Just for once.
Ambassador, and I think it's very important. Remember, I think a few weeks ago, the Office of the National Security Advisor, ONSA, they released the National Security Plan for 2020. Although I must say, with all humility, that NIPS contributed largely towards drawing it up, but we were not invited to the launching, so I think responsible, So we are in Kuru, so in the backwaters. But NIPS is looking at what is called ungoverned space, in Nigeria and also outside. Those ungoverned spaces, particularly in the Sahel, they extend from Mauritania, maybe borders of Mali, right up to Darfur. And Nigeria is located on the periphery of this ungoverned space. And the northeast of Nigeria, the Lake Chad Basin, Zamfara area, completely, northwest, actually, some parts of Taraba, our border areas, they are actually, places you can call ungovernable or ungoverned spaces. The terrorists that you mentioned, sir, are not from outer space. They are human beings. They need space to regroup or to gather. They need space for training. They need habitation. They need food. They need water. They need mobility. So they have to occupy a space. Now, through dereliction, through omission or commission, if a state allows an inch of its territory to become ungovernable or ungoverned, then vicariously it is contributing to the spread of this phenomenon called terrorism. National security must first and foremost start at the level of controlling your space, your territory, denying it to the enemy, whoever that enemy you construct it to be. If it is a terrorist, you have to now deny that space to the terrorists. And if the terrorists, emerge internally, you have to deal with them swiftly. There are ways, measures, strategies for dealing with them. We are doing our best, but it seems our best has not been enough so far. So we need to rethink, recalibrate, and regroup, and to deploy more resources toward this issue. So visit us at NIPS, and we'll give you a lot of materials on these things.
All right, I also wanted to just raise this very briefly as a comment from you. I mean, we're in foreign affairs. How should the government keep track of the commitments and obligations arising from participation in a plethora of summits and fora, MOUs, and so on and so forth?
Good. Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is the natural place to resort to in terms of keeping, the archives, the treaties, and also follow-ups. But I think, I appeared one day here after the TCAD meeting, and I spoke about a national effort towards mobilizing the country in order to tap into this international initiative so that we can benefit from them. If we do not bring all the stakeholders together to work in concert under an umbrella of government effort, all our energies will be dissipated, and the result that we are going to attain or achieve out of these initiatives will be minuscule. So the Minister of Foreign Affairs should be enabled to lead these processes, either at the level of participation or at the level of implementation when we come back home to assess the outcomes of these initiatives.
Okay, thank you so much. You have something
I just want to add quickly that looking at the bilateral relations between Nigeria and Egypt, the last count we have over 12 memoranda of understanding that have been signed between Nigeria and Egypt in the areas of agriculture, education, health. I think when you look at it in our diplomatic missions or our engagement, dozens of memoranda of understanding have been signed. The snag is to set up focus groups to ensure the implementation. I think the Minister of Foreign Affairs need to put in place a monitoring team that will periodically review this memorandum of understanding to see whether it is working and where there's need for a review or adjustment. It can be done. That's just what I want to add on what His Excellency has said, Ambassador. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We've had a very robust discussion, in depth, and so much. It's an eye-opener actually for Nigerians to understand why our president travels to these places, go to this fora. It's all about Nigeria. Yes, and we thank you, Ambassador Usman Sarki. He's Nigeria's former Deputy Permanent Secretary to the United Nations. It's been a pleasure having you on the program. And Ambassador Danladi, as usual, it's a pleasure having you, former Ambassador to Pakistan, on Good Morning Nigeria. And Presidential Aide, Media and Publicity, Mr. Femi Adesina. As always, it's a pleasure having you on Good Morning Nigeria. And now, Sports Update is next.
Aqua United coach John Obo